Okay, so I'm very pleased to present our presenter for Pepper-licious today, Dona Lee. Dona became a certified Arlington Alexandria Extension Master Gardener 5 years ago, but has been gardening off and on her whole life. This is her 4th year teaching classes like vegetable gardening without fear, tomato love, and fall and wintering in our urban agriculture series. She loves vegetable gardening, especially growing different varieties, trying new techniques, and of course, getting to eat the bounty. Welcome, Dona, and thank you so much for this presentation.
Thank you. I've been looking up things as we were waiting. I heard somebody say that they were hardening off their first peppers, and I thought to myself, what are the nighttime, I don't know if it was peppers they were hardening off, what are the nighttime temperatures coming up? And it's interesting that right now they're still in the 40s, so it's still a little bit cold. So it's interesting to see that. So I'm going to let everybody know. So I sent out the presentation in advance because I want you to be able to focus on the conversation and not worry about like trying to get facts down. Some of the slides have a lot of information, and partly that's because as I was doing my research, I got so enthusiastic. I wanted to make sure that I shared it with you. And I'm not going to read the slides, but I want you to have that after the talk so that you can refer to it. I'd like to point out that that pepper on the left on this title page is a Carolina Reaper, which at one point, I'm not sure it still is, was certified by Guinness Book of Records as the hottest pepper in the world with over 1 million Scoville units. And we'll talk about Scoville units later. And that is a pepper I grew this year in my garden. That pepper, that's a picture of that pepper, and it's kind of cool looking. So I put it on the front. And then to the right is the ubiquitous bell pepper, sweet pepper that lots of people like. And we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of how much we like it in the United States shortly. So peppers, hot and sweet, are the 7th most popular vegetable in the world. And as you know, they're beloved from Africa to Asia to Europe to the Americas and to Australia. And so we'll talk a little bit about that because it's quite interesting, and some of that can inform your gardening. It does for me. I learned a lot just doing the research to prepare for this class. So when I was asked to teach this class, I taught a class a couple years ago with Colleen Colleen Kennedy on tomato love, and it was all focused on tomatoes. So I was asked, would I consider doing a class just on peppers? And I thought, yeah, but I don't feel like an expert on peppers. I'm a little nervous about doing that. And so the woman that runs our program, Catherine, said, yeah, but people like to hear about your mistakes and what worked for you. And I said, oh, okay, I guess I can do that. I can tell you about my problems and my mistakes. So the pictures here on this slide are all peppers that I've grown in my garden. This is just a couple. So the top picture, I just grew that this last year. I think that was the hot lemon. The picture on the top in the middle is just on a plate, all the peppers that I picked one day from my garden. I ended up having about 15 varieties. I'd point out that tiny little one here in the bottom of the plate, because we're going to talk about that later. That's a McMahon's Texas bird pepper. It's about 50 Scoville units. In comparison, a jalapeno is like 2,500 to 5,000. So it's a hot pepper, but it's this tiny little bite of hotness. I will say that I made the mistake in the garden of being so excited about the pepper and taking it off the plant and giving it to somebody and saying, here, try this, and not realizing at the time what the Scoville, what the heat rating was for it, and that I gave them this hot, tiny little hotness to eat and no milk or cheese or anything to kind of counteract the heat. So that wasn't such a nice thing of me to do. To the right of that is one of my favorite, mostly sweet pepper. It's a shishito. I learned about it eating it at a restaurant and then found out I could grow them myself. And I love them sauteed as an appetizer all summer long once they start coming in. So that's my shishitos. I've had quite success with that. Sometimes I've managed to harvest as many as 50 peppers a day from just a couple, 3 or 4 plants. I mean, it's crazy. And they keep real well in the fridge. The 2 pictures on the bottom left, those are the Thai chilies that I grow in my front flower bed. So a little bit of edible landscaping there. I had probably, I think, 8 total, some on one side, some on the other side in the other bed. And the picture at the bottom is a bunch of them that were harvested just, one day that year from all those peppers. I had so many, I was giving them to folks at the food bank in little lunch bags because a few peppers can go a long way. But it's not all beautiful. It's not all beautiful peppers. It's not all healthy plants. The picture there on the right was just this last year. I had grown garlic in a bed and harvested it in late June. And so we were trying to decide what we could put in that bed to take advantage of that space that had opened up. So I didn't have any pepper plants ready. I had planted everything that I had started. So I went over to a local nursery near Chinkapin Garden, and they had a bunch of pepper plants. Obviously, at this time of year, when you find a pepper plant at a nursery, they tend to be a little bit stressed. They're usually overgrown in a pot, but yeah, I didn't care. I wanted to try a couple things. So one of the plants I got was that Carolina Reaper, which I was very surprised to find available right there. I also got a Trinidad Scorpion, another really hot pepper. This is an Arapaho, which is fairly hot. And then I got that hot lemon. Well, they were all doing great. It took a while to get off. It was very hot by then in July. And this plant was doing nicely. You can see it's some really nice looking peppers, pretty large. I think they were, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches is the size of them. And one day it looked like that, like literally overnight. And that's one of the blights that we get in peppers in this area. And in chatting with Judy Salveson, who is one of our pepper experts in the Master Gardener group, and she is over at the Potomac Overlook Demonstration Garden, which I highly recommend you go over and take a look at what they're doing there. And she also hosts a Pepper Fest event in the fall that is delightful. You get to go see peppers that she grew, and even taste them, which is even nice to try the pepper to see if you like it. She's had that problem too. And once the blight comes on like that, the peppers are okay to eat. You can harvest them off the plant, which I did. But the plant is gone and you need to remove it. And one of the things that can bring it on is sometimes water issues. And we've had some issues with water this last couple of years in Northern Virginia with the weather. So anyway, so I'm teaching this class. I'm not an expert. It's not all perfect, but I've grown a fair amount of peppers. So I'm hoping that you'll learn something from it and enjoy it. So if already it's starting to sound like I'm going to get into too much and you're fairly new to pepper growing, you just kind of want to know how to get started. When I worked at the Pentagon, we used to have something called bottom line up front, the BLUF chart. And so this is my bottom line up front. If you're growing peppers at a glance, here's what you really need to know. And if you just kind of remember this, the rest of it is all just getting fancier, okay? So it's picking the right plant, and generally the right plant is whatever it is you want to grow. So if you know that you like sweet peppers, it's making sure that you get sweet peppers versus, banana, Hungarian wax peppers. They can come in hot and sweet, and making sure you get the right thing. And so you want to pick what you like. Sweet peppers sometimes have some problems with diseases, and so sometimes you'll see some things that talk on a tag that talk about this pepper being resistant to a certain disease. And if you see that, that's not a bad thing to go for. There's a lot of work going on I'll talk about later in terms of improving peppers. Next thing is to find the right location. So what you want is a well-drained, healthy soil. And Julie's going to give you the link for getting a soil test if you're growing in the garden. And you want at least really over 10 hours of sunlight if you're going to plant in the garden, or if you're going to fill a container and have it maybe on your driveway or in the front of your house or on your patio. Again, you want to have a good 8 hours of sunlight. But you can also grow peppers in containers inside if you have enough light, or you can provide artificial light. And for those, you're going to use commercial potting soil and a 3 to 5 gallon container, like sort of one of those buckets that you can get at a big box store. Okay, so you found the kind of peppers that you like. You found a location or a container that you're going to put it in. So you're going to find a healthy transplant. So healthy meaning you really don't want it to have peppers on it already, little peppers or flowers. You just want a plant that looks really healthy, and you want to look at the roots. Even if you get it at a store, you want to acclimatize it, which means you want to put it outside and get it used to the temperatures at day and night, and used to sunlight. And so you start out in the shade and then you move it outside. And we'll talk about that in more detail a little later. And then when you plant it, you want to put in whatever kind of stakes or support cages that it might need. Now, when do you plant it? When the nighttime temperatures are going to be regularly at least 55 degrees. And so we talk a lot about the Mother's Day rule, and even with climate change, that's still not a bad time to plant things. And again, we're going to talk in more detail, but this is your snapshot. And then lastly, you want to use some kind of a balanced nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus fertilizer. But then later, you want to switch to something that doesn't have as much nitrogen. That's that first number when you look at the numbers on fertilizer bags. And when you water, you don't want to sprinkle from high. You don't want to sprinkle water on the leaves and all. It's not necessary. You can even spread diseases that way. You want to water at the base of the plant, and you want to water as needed. And I'm going to show you this later, but I'll show it now. One of the things you can get for $4 is a water gauge. Stick it in the ground, and that way you can tell how much rain you're getting if you're growing your stuff outside. And then you want to harvest regularly once stuff starts coming in, especially even in the very beginning. You want to start harvesting maybe even some green peppers, because it encourages the plant to put out more flowers, and then that means you'll get more pods. If the temps get over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which in Northern Virginia definitely happens in the August, September timeframe, even July, you need to be patient, because if the temperatures are hot during the day and hot at night over 70, the plant kind of just hangs out there, and you got to be patient. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong. And then here's my get out of jail free card. If you need any help, and if there's any kind of evidence of sort of pest or disease, or just the plant doesn't look well, the people to go to are the help desk. You can email them. Pictures are the best. Send them a picture, explain what you see, and they'll research it and get back to you. And so I don't want to leave you hanging. If you stop right now and you just keep this page and you go off and you plant, the ground doesn't need to be perfect. Your fertilizer routine doesn't need to be perfect. Even watering, just the worst thing you can do is actually overwater peppers, and we'll talk about why in a second when we talk about the where they came from. But really, if you're just starting out with peppers, it's not that complicated. It's a fairly easy plant to grow, and you'll definitely have some success. So let's move on after this and talk about what I'm going to cover. So this may be too much, but I'm going to go into background on peppers. I'm going to talk about the origin, a little bit about plant taxonomy for peppers, and the heat factor, the Scoville unit I've been talking about. I'm going to talk about how to grow peppers, how to buy and grow transplants. The reason we were asking about who's growing seeds is I have a little section on growing transplants from seeds, and I wasn't sure whether I should spend much time on it, but I think I will, and hopefully you'll get something out of it, even if you've already been doing that. And then we'll talk about care and harvest during the season. I'll touch briefly on common pepper pests and diseases, but mostly I'm going to give you some resources, because frankly, I don't see a lot of problems with pepper pests. Sometimes people growing inside have problems with aphids that could be kind of difficult to get rid of, and then some diseases. But I'm gonna give you some resources for that. And then I found so much interesting things about even just the history of peppers that I gave you some links for reading. And then I gave you some recipes. Some are my own and some are links on the web. So let's talk about the origin of the chili pepper. So that picture on the right is today's domesticated wild chili pepper. So it's a chiltepine, and now they call them bird peppers or bird's eye peppers. And you think, well, where that name came from? It's this little kind of thing. It's literally like the size of a pea, a small like baby pea. It gets lots of little green peppers. You can see them in that diagram there. And so it originated in southern Brazil, Bolivia. So basically peppers come from South America and then moved into North America and were domesticated in Mexico, and then moved to the Bahamas, which is where Christopher Columbus found them on his first trip, looking for not pepper like our peppers, but pepper like black pepper, because back in the late 1400s, the 15th century, pepper was as valuable as gold. So he was trying to find his way to the Indies and was looking for black pepper. And so it's interesting because he named them, and the name, let's see if I get this, for pepper is, I think it's, I lost it, pepperine. So it was like black pepper, peppercorns is what he was looking for. So because these were spicy, like pepper is, he named them peppers. And so that name kind of stuck with them. But now you'll also see them called capsicums, which relates to the hot factor that was in them, because the initial peppers were hot. And the reason they were hot and they evolved as these hot little fruits, because this is actually a fruit. Anything that is produced from a flower and has seeds is a fruit. So tomatoes are a fruit, eggplant is a fruit, tomatoes are a fruit. We don't think of them that way because we eat them in sort of a savory way. So we think of them more as a vegetable. But the way these little tiny wild peppers evolved was mammal system couldn't handle the heat. So animals and humans tended to stay away from them, but birds could eat these peppers. It didn't bother their system. Because they didn't chew them, the seeds actually stayed intact. And so they managed to spread these wild peppers all over South America and into North America. And eventually people started trying them because if you tried little bits of them, it was kind of okay. And it allowed you to make the food that you were making better. It was also thought that they were using it in some cases for medical means. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. I just saw in my research, I saw that at the University of California at Davis, they just found evidence of chili peppers in digs that they did 9,000 years ago. So peppers have been around a really, really long time. And the way they find some of this, it's really kind of a hoot. There's this field called paleoethnobotany, and they look at peppers and how they evolved, partly to understand how people move, like the movement of people, because if they could find these traces of like sort of the pepper powder on some of things like mortars and milling kinds of tools in some of these ancient civilizations that they've uncovered, it lets them start to see movement and stuff. So there's a lot of pretty fascinating stuff like that. So Columbus found this stuff. It was already going on for a long, long time in South America and North America. He brought it back to Europe. And then from Europe, probably through the Portuguese and some of the traders, it made its way over to Asia and Africa. And it's been all around the world. And so we find it everywhere. And so this next picture, this is a cool group called Guerrilla Cartology, and they use the idea of maps to explore all kinds of things. And one of the things that they explored was this idea of food. And one of them was chili peppers. So if you look here at this light yellow background, they're showing you in there, that's the origin of capsicum, which is a word for peppers. And so you can see it started all the way down here in South Africa. It was also here in Mexico. And then you see it in the Caribbean. There's other maps that you'll see. I didn't put them in here where it shows you the trade routes, and it shows you how peppers came from here, and then it went back over to Europe. And then from here, it went over to Asia and down to Africa, and then sort of came back around. It's very interesting. The other thing this map actually shows you is by the golden color, that's where people are using peppers, both fresh and dried, or growing them both fresh and dried. The red is just dried peppers, and then the green is fresh. So you can see in the United States, we use a lot of fresh peppers and produce a lot of fresh peppers. That's kind of interesting to me. So let's just take a quick look at pepper production in the United States. So I just covered two because they're quite common here in the US. One is bell peppers and the other is jalapeno peppers. So looking at bells, China grows the most peppers in the world. And so we're number 5. But then India makes most of the pungent peppers. So pungent meaning hot peppers, but in terms of bell peppers. So we produce 1.6 billion pounds of peppers. That was just in 2017, 5 years ago. But yeah, look at that. We actually consume 2.23 billion, which means we have to import peppers to make up the difference. That's kind of crazy. That's a lot of peppers. And then here, if you look at the states that are growing peppers, we have California, Florida, Georgia, but then even you have Michigan in the middle of the country, and then you have a bunch of mid-Atlantic into the southern states. Peppers that we need to supplement our the gap between what we grow and what we consume, a lot come from Mexico. Mexico's government has been really friendly to the pepper growers there in terms of helping them provide ways to increase and lengthen their time of pepper production. And then we also actually export some of our peppers to Germany, Canada, Japan, and the United Kingdom. Now, if you look at jalapeno peppers, the amount that we eat there is a lot less. Although I don't know, 4.3 or 5.9 pounds of pepper per person. When you think of how small a jalapeno is, I guess that's a fair amount. And these numbers are from 15 years ago, 17 years ago. So I'm sure that it's grown. If you look at the bottom there, in 2019, we harvested $63.7 million of jalapenos. That's a hell of a lot of jalapenos. So those are just two of the peppers, and it doesn't cover all of these sort of unique hot peppers like the habaneros and some of the super hots, or some of the ones in between. So let's take a little look at pepper taxonomy. So the So we talk about families, genuses, and species. And so the family that peppers are in is called Solanaceae. And it's also called nightshade. And that includes tomatoes, eggplant, and potatoes. And like I said before, tomatoes and eggplant are both fruits. Potatoes is actually a vegetable because it's the root part of the plants that we eat. One reason it's good to know that is generally when you're planting a garden, you try to rotate out crop families. So you wouldn't necessarily want to put members of the same family in the same spot year after year, because if some of the diseases that are common to those plants will be could be transferred and impact the next season of plants that you put there. Also, the other problem is some of the vegetables that you have may deplete the soil of some of the nutrients that it needs. And if you put the same crop family there, and if you don't bring back some of those nutrients by providing fertilizer or compost or other means like that, they may not have all that they need in the soil. Generally, here's the thing, if you like to grow lots of tomatoes and peppers, you may not have the opportunity to rotate as much because you just don't have enough space in a small garden. My garden is 17 by 17 feet at the community garden, and I have to just focus on improving the soil and growing cover crop over the winter so that my soil is going to be good, because I can't always guarantee that I'm not going to grow members of the nightshade family in the same spot. Then the genus is capsicum. So not only is that the name of the genus, that is also the name that's used, I understand, in Australia for peppers. They call them capsicum. So here's the thing, it's actually a tropical perennial, and as you know, a shrubby plant, meaning not very big, and it has many seeded fruits. Here's the thing, in the absence of winter frost, you can actually, the pepper won't die. I always thought of peppers as annuals because in our area, when I lived in New York, you just knew peppers were going to die. And so you had to plan on planting them again next year. And what I've learned from some of the pepper people on the internet and doing my research is that you can actually take a plant that's done really well for you in the garden here in Northern Virginia, or you know, I thought there was somebody from New Jersey or from somebody in New Jersey, or where it actually gets cold and stuff will die. And you can actually dig it out carefully, put it in a container, prune it, and keep it over the winter, and then plant it out next year so that when you start, you actually have a very healthy, robust plant to get going early. I wished I'd known this sooner, because when I took out my little Texas, McMahon's Texas bird pepper, it was this lovely plant with lots of peppers on it, and it was really, really healthy. And we were getting on to, we were going to have a frost, I think, that weekend, and I ended up pulling it out, and I found out later I could have just dug it out. And it was so small, the plant size was maybe this big and maybe that, and it would have been perfect for inside, except I don't have a lot of sun, so that would have been a problem. Anyway, the next part is, within the genus, there are these 5 domesticated species. And so there's a definition of what domesticated means. There's also a lot of wild species. There's, I think, 35 different wild species that have been identified, and it's kind of always growing, that number. But we're going to talk about the 5 of these. I'll try to get through it quickly, because I know you want to get to like growing peppers. But there's the annuum, which when you think about that, you think the word annual, but actually what I've just told you is peppers are actually perennial. So that name is kind of incorrect. There's the chinense, which means from China, but actually that's not even correct, because those peppers aren't from China. Then there's the frutescens, the bacumtum, and then the pubescens. It's interesting to know about these species, because if you get to the point where you want to actually try to cross peppers and grow a new variety, or if you happen to have different ones of these varieties in your garden, they could be crossed accidentally through birds or insects. And you might, if you save seed, get something that's not quite what you expected that next season. So I thought it'd be nice to kind of learn a little bit about that. All right, so here's the annuum. So again, pretty much they're all from some part of South America, but many of these are domesticated. And these are the ones that you're used to seeing. It's the bells, the jalapenos, the cayennes, the poblanos. My understanding is that the bell pepper was domesticated and bred to be a pepper without any capsicum. So it has no heat to it. I couldn't find much information on actually who did that. I was looking, but I came across that notion that all peppers were hot and then they were bred to be with no capsicum, so no heat. So they go from enormous, right? These really thick bell peppers to those tiny little berry-like ones, that bird pepper that I showed you on that plate in the picture of my peppers that I've grown. And you get everything in this thing. You get all colors of peppers in this species. Not only in the pepper plant, but there's a fish pepper plant that I've grown that has white and green variegated leaves. And then it has these striped peppers that are green and white, and then they turn to red, and it's a nice hot little pepper. There's a lot more information on these species summaries on this pepper geek page that's very readable and kind of nice. So I like that. So here you go. We have a hot pepper. So these are the Chinese, hottest peppers in the world. Some of them are over 1 million on the Scoville scale. They're hot, but they try to breed them so that they have some nice flavors, both floral flavors. Some have citrus. Some are even a little bit smoky. Some of them are considered ugly peppers, but it depends upon your point of view. Like I look at that pepper in the upper right there, and I think that's kind of a really cool looking pepper. Or that Carolina Reaper I had on the cover with that little stinger that came down. And in the references, there's a pepper group on Facebook called Pepper Lovers. That's all they do is they try to breed peppers and grow them, and they talk about the way they look with the stinger and stuff. And it's a lot of fun if you want to actually get into that. So this is one of the most popular species that's kind of working in that area. But it takes a long time to actually settle down a new species, so that or a new variety, so that it's actually stable, and then you'll get the same thing from the next generation. So this variety here, sometimes it's considered a subset of Aninum, but this is the Tabasco or the peri-peri. So there's a little picture of it. And if you look at it there, a lot of peppers were sort of upright kind of peppers, but as we've bred some of them to be bigger, they've gotten heavier and they tend to sort of hang down a little bit more. But the Tabasco pepper, which is the famous one for Tabasco brand sauce, is a single pepper variety. And it's got a lot of hot heat. Some people feel it doesn't have a lot of flavor, but it's a pretty little pepper, and those guys have done a really good job with their business, just growing that pepper and making sauce out of it. So this is a really interesting one. That in the top right is the Sugar Rush peach pepper. It's really beautiful. It's got that sort of stripe. Somebody got a pepper variety that had that stripe on it unexpectedly, and they said, I want to do more of this. So they've been trying to breed that and stabilize it. And the picture there next to it is the Brazilian starfish. It's a nice little pepper. They can be a little bit taller, so they can be more like 3 foot tall, and they have these pretty heavy pods. So, and they tend to use the word pods, meaning peppers, and then some of them have like these longer stems for hanging, sort of hanging down with the pod hanging down from it. Ahi is the Peruvian name for pepper, and so there's a lot of ahi varieties that you can find. Ahi lemon drop, ahi amarillo, and they tend to be hot, but they're a variety of hot, and they tend to focus a lot on flavor. So you can have these earthy ones, you can have these fruity ones, and they're pretty interesting too. And then the last one, this one's from Bolivia and from Peru, pubescens. It's a little bit hard to find here. On that pepper group I was telling you that I'm on Facebook, I see people trying to get seed, but what's interesting is the pepper seeds are black in this variety, and the plants actually are kind of hairy on the foliage part. And the peppers look a little bit like, if you look at that one there, that's the manzano. It looks a little bit like an apple, and so sometimes they call them apple peppers. They're good for stuffing. They can be a little bit hot. Apparently the flowers are kind of purplish, so they're really pretty, but it's a little bit hard to find those kinds of peppers here. The Lakota ones are a little bit like of a longer shape, a little bit more oblong. But anyway, so that's the 5 species of peppers. So besides the fact that they taste good, why are we growing peppers, and what are the benefits of peppers? First of all, they're a low calorie food. You can actually, in one pepper, get all of the, I think it's potassium that you need for a day in a single, like a bell pepper. And if you get a red bell pepper, they actually have a little bit more seed and more nutrients in them because they've been on the plant a little longer and they develop a little bit more of the vitamin C. They also have vitamin A. You get a big range of flavors, you know, from the mild or totally sweet to the hot to the smoky. And people use them in everything from spices to sauces. The Epicurious link there was kind of nice because it talks about different peppers and recipes, and then I give you some at the end. So here you go. So capsicum, also the name that given to peppers, is means to bite in Greek. And so the heat from the peppers comes from these alkaloid chemicals, and they're called capsaicinoids. And two of those are capsaicin and dihydrocapsaicin. And the next chart, we're going to talk a little bit about how we measure that, or how we used to measure that. But they actually are using capsaicin to relieve pain from like shingles and from diabetes. They have ointments that they make that have some capsaicin in them that help with muscle pain. It's something about the heat. Let me see. I have a note. Sorry, the heat stimulates the hypothalamus gland, and that helps with relieving some of the pain. I guess it's so hot it takes your mind off of that other pain that you really had. And I love this little quote down there from this English botanist. So cayenne is this violent fruit, and it helps digestion, provoke urine, relieve toothache. I mean, that just cracks me up. So I had to put it in there. All right, so let's look at pepper parts. Don't worry about all the words. This is a reference for you so that you'll have it. But if you want to understand the heat of peppers, I wanted to show you the pepper parts. So the top, you have the stem, and then those little leaves that are left over is the calyx. But what's important is that part there, right here, that's labeled placenta. So this here is the placenta of the plant. And this is the pith, this white part coming down. And what a lot of people think is that the seeds, but not only the pepper, but the seeds of the pepper are hot. And actually the seeds really aren't hot. What's hot is the pepper itself. And then this white pith part, placenta, is hot. And actually the heat in the pepper generally will be a little bit less hot at the apex or at the end, and hotter as you go up towards the stem, which kind of makes sense because these capsaicin glands are right here between the placenta and the seeds. So they're right in here. So the thing is, you know, you could generally you take the seeds out when you're cooking. First of all, because the texture of eating the seeds isn't all that great. But if you're taking them out primarily because you think you're reducing the heat of the pepper, that is definitely not the case. So don't worry about that. They're not bad to eat. I just don't think they're that good. Like my husband makes a sriracha, and I've given you the recipe for it in one of the hand or a link at the end. But I have him take the seeds out and at the end because I just didn't like the texture of getting the seeds in, you know, in my mouth. It wasn't good. So this is just for reference, so you know all the parts and you understand about where the hot stuff comes from. So let's talk about measuring the pungency of peppers. So Wilbur Scoville is a chemist who in 1912, working for Park Davis in Detroit, developed this organoleptic test. So literally he used people to try basically hot chili water. And what he did was he made these samples of chili water and he kept diluting them with more water, keeping track of how much he was adding until as the subjects were eating this chili water, they didn't have any perception of heat anymore on their palate. And that became what they called the Scoville heat units. Today, you don't have to, and there's some, you know, there's a little bit of subjectivity there and, you know, person to person and how much pepper can you eat at one point before your palate is just blown out. But today we actually use this technique called high performance liquid chromatography, and that measures the capsaicin. And then they have a formula to actually put it back into Scoville units because people are used to the Scoville units and understanding what that means. Interesting thing in this book of compounding, which is like this famous book, he was more than about peppers. He did a whole lot of different things throughout his career, but he wrote this book, The Art of Compounding, which was apparently you know, the Bible for a long time in the pharmacology trade. But it mentions milk as an antidote for pepper heat. So it's still called the Scoville scale. This database is great at the scovillescale.org organization. you can go in there and put in a kind of pepper that you're thinking of growing, and it'll tell you the Scoville units that it has. But there's a diagram from that site. There's a ton of really cute little diagrams that you can find out there with Scoville units and pictures of chilies and all that. And but this one was kind of nice. So you see down there at the bottom, bell peppers are 0, and then you can see within that 0 to 2,000 Scoville unit range, you get Lombardo. Now within a pepper, a hot pepper, like even like say jalapeno, when you grow them, they're not all the same. Like I've decided that some of my jalapenos don't seem as hot as they used to be, so I shifted up to more habaneros, which before I used to think habaneros were just too hot for my palate. Now maybe my palate has gotten more acclimated to heat, or maybe the peppers just aren't quite as hot. If you're thinking about growing hot peppers or growing what they call the super hots or the even just really hots, keep in mind that the capsaicin, it will definitely cause a burning sensation on the skin. I wear gloves when I work with habaneros or anything in that hot range or hotter, and I can still feel some of the capsaicin heat coming through the gloves, even like hours later. So I actually use the gloves. I actually wash off all my tools, but I still have the gloves on, using soapy water. If you use hot water, the steam just from cleaning will cause the heat and the vapor from the capsaicin to get into your eyes. It's kind of crazy. But definitely don't touch your face and your eyes while you're working with peppers. If you have experience with them, you already know this, but if you're thinking of moving that way, I wanted to make sure you were aware. So let's take some questions.
Okay, so one question we have is about overwintering peppers, as you mentioned earlier. What do you need to do once you dig them out and bring them inside? Do they need water? Do they need sun?
I'm not going to get into it in detail here, but there was one website I give at the end. It's called chiliman.org, and he has a nice little grow guide on overwintering peppers. And I read through it, and I think it does a good job of telling you what you need to do. So that's why I'm going to give you that reference instead of me trying to take the time. But basically, you're going to water some, and you're going to prune it way back. Like when you look at it, some of these look like sticks because you're not necessarily trying to have peppers over the winter. Now, if you're going to try to actually grow it inside over the winter and continue to have peppers, you're going to take a slightly different approach when you pot it up.
Okay. Another question we had was about watering with peppers, and does the amount of water you give them affect how hot they get?
I don't know. I haven't found I haven't come across the exact answer to that. I think definitely different conditions. I don't know. Okay. Sorry.
And then another question, or it's more, I guess, just an observation, and maybe you've had this experience too. One person mentioned sneezing a lot when handling jalapenos last summer. She could also feel the heat in the hands, but I guess with the sneezing, have you encountered that as well? Or is that like a common thing?
Absolutely. One thing we learned during COVID was actually the fact that we have these masks is kind of helpful. My husband has actually started using his COVID mask when he mixes up a batch of sriracha, which is what he did yesterday, because it helps kind of keep some of that from getting into his sinuses as he's working. So there's one benefit of COVID. Never thought of using a mask before.
Yeah. But
yeah, definitely cough like crazy. Sometimes it just gets into your sinuses. And like I said, just washing my utensils. Or yesterday I had a hot cayenne pepper that somebody had given me that I decided I was going to take to a mortar and pestle to and break it up into some hot pepper flakes. And just, I thought that will be better than putting it in a grinder because it won't have all the dust flying all over. But just still using the mortar and pestle and breaking it up, it was still like, I guess, microscopic bits of the pepper were getting in the air, and it was causing me to cough. I was a little surprised by that.
Yeah. And then I guess we had just a clarification on the Chili Man website. Is it chiliman.org?
It said, don't worry about any of the links I give you there at the end. If you got the presentation, it's at the very end of the PDF file. Okay. Don't worry, chiliman.org.
Okay. That's it.
That's why I'm giving it to you, so you don't have to worry that you're going to lose anything. You don't have to rush to copy it down. Okay. So let's talk about, good, got all the questions? Let's talk about pepper growing basics. I'm going to focus I'm going to talk about pepper growing basics in general. I'm probably going to be guilty of focusing on our area here in Northern Virginia. At the very end, I give you some links to websites so that if you're starting out and you don't know yet, and you need to find out when is your last frost date or what area that you're in, so you can go and look, and also so that you can find your local extension office for your area, because they're all across the country. So as we talked about before, peppers are a warm season crop. So you're growing them during the warm summer season. They do really well when the temps are 70 to 80 degrees during the day and 60 to 70 during the night. So, one of the problems is that's not what our temperatures are all summer, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, at least in our area. They definitely want 8 or more hours of sunlight. Will they do okay at less than 8? You'll get peppers, you just might not get the as much of a harvest as you would like. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't try it. If you have shade though, like, shade is considered, I think, 4 hours of sunlight a day. I think it'd be kind of tough, but you can always experiment. What does it cost you? $4 for a plant, a pot, some dirt. And if you really like to grow peppers, you can experiment. They like fertile, organically rich soil and well-drained soil, and pH. I see all different things. 6 to 6.8, definitely slightly acidic. If you remember from school, 7 is neutral, over 7 is alkaline, and under 7 is acidic. My garden tends to be barely acidic, or sometimes even a little alkaline. So that means my peppers could have a little bit of problem actually taking up some of the other nutrients in the soil. So, I'm trying to add lots of organic matter, and that helps me. It's helping me over time to get my pH down a little bit. There's some other classes that we have. We taught a class on just general vegetable gardening, and we talk a little bit more about some of the soil, things about soil, how to find out whether your soil is well drained. And so I'm going to leave that for that. You can find it on our website. I'm going to give you a link at the end. So typical maturity for peppers, somewhere between 52 to 100 days. I have, let's see, I pulled out my pack of seeds from last year. I grew about 10 different kinds from seed, and then I bought some. And in looking, some are 50 days, most are more, most are 60, 70, maybe even 90. My habaneros took 100 days. If you're growing some of these crazy super hots, like these special hybrids that people are doing, they can take 100 to 150 days, so a long time. And sometimes even the germination can be longer for some of the super hots. So you need, like I put in the Carolina Reaper in July. It took a really long time, and I probably got maybe a half a dozen peppers off it by the time we got to actually the cold season. And that was something I probably could have potted up if I live in a townhouse, and so I don't have a lot of light, but if I wanted to and wanted to give it some artificial light, I could have potted it up and maybe tried to bring it inside. But I started it so late that I didn't get much. But let me just say 6 super hot peppers was plenty. It was a hot pepper. So because of the maturity time, because you need this, so that's what, 2 months to 4 months, because you need this time. We tend to start them inside, and then we transplant them out. We don't tend to put seed in the ground and wait for it to germinate, because that could take a week, it could take 2 weeks. So you've lost that time, and then it takes time before it actually gets big enough that it's going to start to create flowers. So we tend to do them as transplants. So for our Northern Virginia area, if you're not in this area, you'll want to look up your own information, but we're in zone 7AB. So we're getting close to our last killing frost for the spring, and it's usually the beginning part of April. And then but our first killing frost in the fall is the beginning part of November. Now, the thing is, you have to keep in mind, if you're a gardener, you've been gardening, you already pay attention to the weather. If you're starting out, you have a phone that's just kind of handy. You can have the weather at your fingertips. Like I looked before we started to say, what's the nighttime temperatures for the next week? And it looks like they're going to all still be well in the 40s. So that's good for me to know. But 2 years ago, we had a frost in like the early April, and then all of a sudden May, I think it was 6th or 8th, we had a frost where it got down to 32 degrees, and a bunch of people had already planted their peppers and tomatoes, and some of them just had a little bit of leaf damage, and some of them actually lost their plants. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't plant early. It just means you have to pay attention to the weather because you may need to do something to protect them. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So here in our growing season, if you take into account those dates, the beginning of April to the beginning of November, we have basically over 180 days of growing season. And actually we have almost closer to 210 days of growing season, although at the beginning and the end, the days are shorter or get shorter. So you don't have as much daylight. We tend here to have a lot of hotter summer days and nights. And so for the purposes of peppers and actually tomatoes as well, the plants kind of sort of can sit and you won't get as much flowering or you'll get flowering and no fruit set until the weather starts to cool off. And then it picks back up again. So it can be a little discouraging because you're looking at your plant and the plant looks really good and it's sort of not doing anything, but you just have to be patient. The other thing for our area is our average annual rainfall is 40 inches. So typically you want to get about an inch of rain if you're planting outside in your garden. And what you'll find is if you look that, some weeks you don't get any and some weeks you get a lot. And we'll talk about that in terms of how it impacts peppers in a little bit. We got 57.3 inches in 2020, but then in 2021, it went back down to, I think a little bit over the average, but in August this last year, we got 6 inches of rain in 1 week. That really impacted some of our pepper production because that was way too much rain for what's this tropical kind of deserty sort of plant. And depending on your soil, if you have the clay soils like we have that are pretty dominant in Northern Virginia, that can mean that the rain and the water is just sitting possibly at the root level of your plants, which isn't good. So I wanted to show, this is our schedule for what we call Zone 7. And at the end, I give you a picture of our planting calendar for this area, for Alexandria, Arlington, and Zone 7. And the backside of that, and I give you a link so you can actually print a copy, is this nominal schedule for Zone 7. So part of why I wanted to teach this class and asked to teach it in March is it's a perfect time for you to start seedlings indoors if you want, or at the very least start to prepare and identify what it is that you want to grow so that you can be on the lookout for plants later this month and into April. And so you see there, we talk about the Mother's Day rule. Doesn't mean that's when you have to wait till then, but we're going to talk about more what you're going to look for in terms of the optimum time to plant. But I just wanted you to see this nominal schedule. All right, so we're getting ready to plant peppers. So the question is, what are you going to do with them? Am I going to make sauce? Am I going to use them in cooking? What am I willing to buy at the store? What is it I'd like to grow myself? Like I don't grow a lot of bell peppers because I'd rather grow some of the other varieties. Like I love to grow shishitos. And even though I've started to find them in the store and like even these little vacuum packs ready to go, I like growing them fresh. Then the question is, how much do I need? How much do I want? What variety? Am I going to grow 4 shishitos and just maybe 1 habanero? But you want to think about that because every pepper plant needs, at the very least, it needs a square foot of space. And some of the pepper plants need actually, say, 2, like they may need 18 or 24 inches between them. And you'll know this. We'll show you how to find that out if you're not aware. So you need to start thinking about how much space do I have? What do I want? And then you're going to have to sort of balance out what do I want and what can I have? The other thing is, what is my heat threshold? You can use that Scoville chart, Scoville page and look at a pepper that you're thinking of growing, or you're at the nursery and you find a pepper and you want to check it out and see, you can look it up real quick and they'll tell you the Scoville units. And if you know what a jalapeno is, and if you know that a jalapeno is about most heat you want, then what you want to do is kind of keep your heat threshold at that level or below. Then you want to think about where you're going to grow them. You may already know that you're going to grow them in the ground. You may know that you're going to use a container. Maybe you've decided you have a raised bed, or maybe you've decided that you're going to want to add a raised bed because you think it'll be better soil because you have so much clay right now in your beds. And then lastly, are you going to buy seeds and grow your own transplants? Or are you going to buy transplants? And I'll talk about some of the advantages of that. And then how much time do I have for taking care of the plants, both in terms of, say, you're growing plants from seeds, and also do you have time taking care of the plants once they're in the garden or in your containers and you're taking care of them. I think peppers in general don't take that much time, unlike things like, I think tomatoes take more time. You do a lot more pruning and you have to pay a lot more attention in terms of getting them off the plant to protect them from birds and animals, where peppers in general aren't attacked by deer or anything like that. So I think not as much time, but still, if you have a lot of plants, it could be a lot of work. So you want to get 6 to 8 plus hours of sunlight. 8+ is better. You want to have good airflow. The more airflow you have, like you can plant your peppers sometimes closer, but if you don't have a lot of airflow, some of the diseases like the blights can be, conditions are optimum for them to develop. You definitely need an adequate water supply in terms of either, hose. If I'm in a community garden, is there water there? If you're growing it at home, it should be pretty simple. If you have a really windy location, especially when you plant young pepper transplants, heavy winds or if a real storm comes through can actually can kill young tender pepper transplants. So you'll want to keep an eye out on weather. If you have a location that's typically good, but we have some bad weather coming in, you may need to think about some kind of temporary wind protection. Again, we talked about healthy soil. If you do a soil test, which I highly recommend if you've never done it and you're planting in your garden, it'll tell you what the pH is of your soil. It can't tell you nitrogen because nitrogen dissipates over time, but it can tell you your potassium and your phosphorus, and then a bunch of the other minute minerals like magnesium and calcium. And it can also tell you how much organic matter you have in your soil. So there's a link that folks will put in there in the chat, and it costs, I think, $16 for the whole test if you ask for organic matter. You send in your soil sample, you send in the form and your money, and in about 2 weeks, they'll email you back, or less, they'll email you back some information, and they'll give you some recommendations if you need to do anything. So we've talked about, you have these choices: traditional garden, raised bed, containers. So let's go. So consider where you're going to plant, how much space you have, what you'll need. If you want to do, I tend to do not so much square foot, but I sort of do groups or groupings of peppers. So I might have a 3-foot bed, or either a raised bed or even just a sort of in the ground bed. And I might sort of stagger my peppers so that I can have a little bit more in the bed than if I just sort of did them in rows. Because I don't like the fact that I have to put rows at 30 to 36 inches apart. So I'd rather sort of, if I do them diagonally, I can do like 12 or 24 inches on the diagonal from plants and get a few more in. So I like to do that. But you also need to allow spacing for some kind of stake or some kind of cage to support the plants. My Texas bird peppers were so small, it didn't really need any kind of support. But some of my larger ones, like my ahi ones, definitely, and my fish peppers, they needed a little something. If you can find a stand of bamboo and you're free to cut it down, I've done that. And you get these 20-foot pieces of bamboo, and you can cut them down into, say, 4-foot, 5-foot pieces, and you put them in when you actually plant, so that you're not going to disturb the roots later. And then you sort of lightly, I like to use this plant Velcro, lightly put it around the plant and around the stake. That works out pretty well. It's low cost, so that's kind of nice. But you need to grow what you want to eat, so you need to think about what you're going to grow, pick something, and figure out whether you're going to be able to buy it at the store as a transplant, or you may have to grow it from seed because you can't yet get it at the store. I found that nurseries in our area here in Northern Virginia have become, have a lot more variety of some of the hotter peppers and the more interesting peppers, I guess because there's demand. The only thing you have to be careful about with some of the nurseries is they tend to have peppers way earlier than you really are going to put them into the ground. So if you get them, you're going to have to keep them going well, and then you're still going to have to harden them off. And we'll talk about that in a minute before you can put them in the ground. But sometimes I've been at the nursery and I see somebody buying a pepper plant and it's like now, and there's no way that they should put it in the ground now. But you would think because it's being sold at the nursery that means it's time. And so people may not know. If you're doing containers, it's really pretty easy. You get a 3 or 5 gallon bucket. I think 5 gallons good. Even those ones you see at the big box stores, they sell for, I don't know, $5 or something. You want to put a high quality organic potting mix in it. Definitely don't use garden soil. You got all the insects and the weeds and whatever disease might be in there. Plus, we talked about our clay, it holds too much water, it doesn't let air in. So you definitely don't want to use garden soil, but you want to use a potting mix. And so when we say avoid a soilless mix, you don't want to use like a seed starting mix because that tends to not have enough structure to it. And you need something that's going to be able to support the plant roots. And you're still going to want to put some kind of support in those buckets, unless it's definitely going to be like a smaller, like some of the Thai chilies only grow like a foot or two, and they might be okay without support. But some of the bigger plants, especially if they're going to be covered in pepper pods, like you're hoping, you're going to want to put something in to support them. And so you'll do that in the beginning. And then they have some of these fancy potting soils where they have these like polymer products where it helps with water, but we've sort of decided at Master Gardeners that they're not all that good because they think it pulls the moisture into these little like capsule-y things and away from some of the tiny root hairs. So we don't really recommend that. But we don't recommend anything specific. Whatever, there's lots of high quality organic potting soils out there. So say you're going to buy transplants. There's lots of sources. There's all the retail stores, right? There's the nurseries, little local hardware stores. Sometimes even the grocery stores have them. Or there's what I call the big box stores. So that's like the Home Depots or the Lowe's or any of those kinds of places. Online seed companies not only sell seeds, but a lot of them will actually sell pepper plants. And I have actually bought pepper plants in the past from some of these online seed companies, in part because I wanted to try one thing. And so I could buy a seed packet, for $3, $4, $5, or I could just buy the one plant for $4 or $5, and they'll ship it to me. And they've done well. I've done that with a couple of them. And mostly because I was growing some unusual kind of hot pepper that I wanted to try that I hadn't heard of. And since I only wanted one plant, it's kind of a easy decision unless the shipping is high. The other way you can get pepper plants is friends, neighbors. If you're in a community garden, somebody may have some extra plants. There's lots of local plant sales. Master Gardeners of Virginia sponsors one coming up. And the farmers market often have vendors that are selling plants there. I often give away lots of plants because when I grow my plants from seeds, I end up with extra. I'll talk about that in a minute. I did a count on my plants from last year and I was surprised myself. But anyway, you might want to check for varieties that offer some disease resistance, especially maybe in the bell peppers. They seem to have some issues with some diseases, and they're working a lot, companies, on coming up with plants that are resistant. So you may see some mention of that on the plant tags. But you want to look at the leaves, you want to look for spots, for insects. Does it look good? Don't hesitate to gently take the plant out of the container and see if it's root bound. If it's already root bound now, it's kind of undergoing some kind of stress. So it's not really great. Now I'll say that when I bought those Carolina Reaper plants and those other 4 plants, they definitely were somewhat root bound, but I bought them anyway because I kind of wanted some pepper plants. It's the only way I could get them, and they did okay. The other thing is you don't really, in the case of peppers, want a plant that has flowers and peppers growing on it already. Matter of fact, what they recommend is if you get a plant like that, because that's the one you ended up choosing or you didn't have a lot of choice, that you actually take them off, because what we're going to talk about is as we're getting started in transplanting our plants into the ground, what we really want them to do is focus on growing leaves and not putting energy to flowers and pepper pods. So that's something to keep in mind. Some people like that because they think it's really good and it gives them a head start, but not necessarily. So we came up with this list of pros and cons when we were talking about growing stuff and transplants for our vegetable gardening class. And that's my backyard. So I live in a townhouse. So if you can imagine, when I'm growing peppers, I take over the laundry room. I've now this last year taken over both of my spare bedrooms because I need space to have lights once my peppers germinate and I have to put them into pots. So what you see there is a lot of different things. There's some peppers, there's tomatoes, there's some flowers, and that's my hodgepodge of trays that they're in. And so at this point, I was trying to harden them out. And so my backyard faces north, so I was starting them out there. But here's the thing. The biggest pro is it lets you grow the kind of variety that you want, and that you may not be able to find it in the retail store. So back when I realized I love shishitos, I would buy shishito seed and I would grow them from seed. But what I've noticed over the last few years, say with shishitos, is I can actually find them at like the local Home Depot or one of the hardware stores if I get there early and pay attention, which might mean that I'm buying my pepper plants earlier than I want, and then have to kind of keep an eye on them to keep them going before I'm ready to plant them. But I might do that if I wasn't growing any from my own transplants. You definitely know what kind of conditions they've been under, and it allows you to time it some if you want to go get your stuff in the ground a little bit early, or kind of have them ready to go. Obviously, you have all the time in the world to plant it yourself. I'm not sure it saves you money. It may eventually save you money. It just depends upon how you do it, and what kinds of things you save to use in following years, like some of the pots and stuff. But I have to say, it's pretty satisfying unless it gets out of hand. And you can get the kids involved. They can help you plant a little bit, and they can definitely help you water a little bit. And it's just fun and very satisfying. And you can share with your neighbors, so that's always good. The cons, there are definitely some initial costs, and then some annual costs. So there's the seeds. You use seed starting soil in the beginning, and then when you pot up your plants, you switch to potting soil. You may need grow lights. Some people are able to do it with natural light in their homes. Some cannot. I can't. You'll need some kind of trays or containers. Some of the stuff you can get like a dollar store pretty cheap, and pots. You definitely need some space for, I don't know, a month and a half, 2 months or more, where you can have these things growing. And then you definitely need to pay. Really every day I look at my plants and I decide, do they need water? How are they doing with the light? Do I need to move them? But it's okay. I like it. You may find, if you weren't expecting it, you may feel that that's just too much. So it could become overwhelming. So here's some of the supplies you might need. In that picture there, somebody made little pots out of newspaper. I've tried that. I've also tried toilet paper rolls and paper towel rolls, where I've cut the bottom and sort of put the ends in to make sort of a bottom out of it, and then use that for soil. The only thing I found was as they get wet, they started to like come apart. And so in the end, it was a little hard to work with them. And then when I had to repot them, it was a little messy, but it was, it was free and I got to try it. So you need grow lights, you need the soil, the containers. You'll need some kind of a tray with either a cover, which they sell for not very much money, a tray with sort of pots in it, peat pots, or some kind of a plastic cover that you're going to put on yourself or wrap. In this case, for peppers, you're going to need seeds. The seeds tend to be viable for 3-4 years. Some kind of spray bottle with water to maybe spray the surface after you plant the seeds. And then some kind of heat pad. For peppers, it's really helpful. I used to use a regular heat pad that I use, like, for your muscles when they're sore. And I just put my plant on that while I was waiting for them to germinate. But now I actually bought a heat pad because I actually want to be able to regulate the temperature now that I've learned more, because peppers actually like a hotter temperature for quicker or better germination. And the last thing is some kind of fan or other heat source. I happen to have like the 6 or 7 inch, like a small fan like this. It's on a USB cord, and I can it's one of those things I think you can plug into a computer. So while you're sitting at your computer, you can get a little bit of air. What I do is I use that and I put it in place periodically and move it around to my different trays of transplants to give them a little airflow. Some people just put their hand lightly over the top of their plants to give them a little. The reason you do that, it helps strengthen the stems. So planting seeds. So here's a Thai dragon pepper seed packet I planted. These are the seeds I planted in 2020, and then last year again as well for my edible landscaping. So they have a lot of information on there, and you want to read the packet. Some seed packets give more information than others. Some seed packet or seed companies send you back to their website to look for information. Those aren't my favorite packets. I love ones like this from Lake Valley, or Botanic Interest does a nice job with their seed packets. But what you're looking for is what's the seed depth, which for peppers is typically about 1/4 inch. What kind of plant spacing for this variety? How long will it take to sprout? So these are 10 to 20 days. Some peppers will say 7 to 14 days. And then they tell you how long it takes for them to mature. So the maturity is from when you transplanted the pepper plant into the garden. it'll take about 70 days till you'll get your first pepper. And then what I've read is from once you get your first flower, it becomes a small pepper. It'll take like 35 days or something till you get your first pepper that you actually can pick. So typically what packages will say is that you want to start your pepper plants 8 to 10 weeks before your last frost for your area. So for our area, that'd be around early February to early April. I tend personally not to start quite that early, just a little bit too much time having to babysit my transplants, but I know people that do actually start them that early. Then you can also start them as late as late March, early April, but then keep in mind you won't be able to plant those until probably 5 or 6 weeks later. So you want to fill your container with the seed starting mix. You want to add 2 or 3 seeds to each little section, and I usually moisten my soil first. I put my seeds in it, and then I put a little more seed soil on top, and then I use my little spray bottle to kind of gently spray it. Really important, you got to label each container or grouping of containers with something so that you know what it is you planted, unless you're planting only one thing. So when I did my 10, I used little stickers with just a number, and then I had a little a map that told me what things were. Some people will put a label on the outside of the container. Sometimes you can use a Sharpie, but you need to come up with something, because when they come up, they all look alike. Then you want to lightly cover it with some kind of plastic wrap or this plastic top. And then you want to place it in a warm place to germinate. So if you don't have a heat pad, you can put it on top of the refrigerator, anything like that, because seeds don't need sun. What they need is moisture, and they need heat. So you want to keep it moist. You definitely don't want it soaking wet. If it gets too wet, drain the water off. Try to maybe blow a little air on it to get some of the water out. If you get condensation, take the cover off and drain it off. So your seedlings should come through, and I have X days because it depends upon what the seed packet says. Like I've seen some that say 7 to 14. In case of some of the really hot seeds, some of them can take as long as 2 to 4 weeks. So you really have to be patient with some of those. The Texas bird pepper seeds took a really long time to come through. And I had another one I tried called Vitali, which is an African pepper. And that one took a really long time to come through. So you get this first set of seeds, and they're called the cotyledons. And the next set of seeds you get are what we call the true seeds. So the first set of seeds are the ones that are from inside the seed, and then the next ones are the good ones. So what you start to look at is the sets of true seeds as they develop. So there you go. You can see the first set of seeds there, and then you can see the next set that's coming out. So those pictures are my some of my seed starting. So I think the top picture, you can see my toilet roll things, which didn't do so great. And then the bottom picture is after I had shifted my plants the next level up into 3-inch pots. So as soon as you start to get germination, you can move your transplants under light. So here's one of the things I learned the first time I started doing transplants is I had this 72 section, I guess it was a Jiffy seed starting kit. So it has a black tray bottom, it has a plastic top, and then it had these pots that were connected, that were little square pots, and there were 72 of them. So the first time I started seeds, I did a bunch of different varieties. I did tomatoes, I did peppers, I did a whole bunch of things, and different kinds of peppers and tomatoes. What happens is once you start to get germination, you need to be able to take those plants that have started and move them under light. And if you have this big old connected thing, you may have some things that haven't yet germinated, and you have things that have. And so what I've learned to do is, in the case of using that kind of setup, is I actually took scissors, and before I started planting anything or putting dirt in it, I cut them into little 3 by 2 little sections. And I made sure that in each section, I grew the same kind of things, at least, like peppers, and peppers that I thought would sort of germinate at the same time, or tomatoes that I thought would germinate, so that as they were germinating, I could take them out and put them under light and leave the other ones there still on the heat pad, waiting to germinate. In some cases, sometimes I would have to cut them into like little two section pieces to be able to get them under light. So that was kind of how I do it, which is a little bit, it's gotten better since I learned not to mix everything up so much. So that's one of my lessons learned. So once you have them, you put them either under grow lights or in some kind of a really good south facing window. If your plants start to get really leggy and you see them really like growing to the light, that means that they're probably not close enough to the light, or the light's not strong enough. And so you may need to think about grow lights. And if they start growing one way, even though they're maybe a little bit higher, like close, maybe not leggy, but they're kind of like growing to the light, you want to turn them around frequently so you sort of can keep them growing straight. And then what I do is I basically put a fan on them for brief periods to toughen the stems. I try to go for 12 hours of grow light a day. And if I just have one set of trays of plants, I just put it on a timer and let it shut off. So I do like 6 to 6 or something like that, or 8 to 8. When I start to have too many plants and I have to do like 2 sessions, then I actually have to put one set of trays in and then 12 hours later, swap them out with another set of trays. That gets a little bit complicated, but it's doable. You definitely only want to water from the bottom. You don't want to let them sit in water. And for peppers, you really want them to dry out a little bit in between watering. You don't want to keep them soaked. Peppers can get transplants can get diseases from being too wet, and they can get what they call damping off, and you'll lose them. Sometimes you can even get a little bit of mold. So definitely don't worry about them being a little bit dry. Remember, they're a tropical plant. So when they get 1 or 2 of these real sets of leaves, then you can actually pot them up like I have in the lower one there. You could use 3-inch peat pots like those. You could use, I've used cups. I've used whatever. You know, if you can find square pots, those are nice because they're a little bit more easier to put into the trays that you use. I use like those 9x3 aluminum trays a lot. So here's my experience last year when I talk about, you know, keeping track of what you do. Oh dear. I planted a bunch of varieties. I kept track of when they germinated, how I fertilized them, and it was good because this year I'm trying to think about when do I want to start, and I can look at what I did last year and when I got them into the garden, and I could say, well, if I want to get them into the garden a little bit earlier, I might start a little earlier. So it's just an example. People do it on the computer, you know, whatever. And here is my seed starting sort of little journey. That's my little Jiffy pot thing. I put them under those kind of lights. That was me potting out in the top right, lower bottom. So now they're under lights 12 to 18 hours a day. And what I do is I just keep my lights attached to these shelves above my washer and dryer. And what somebody mentioned to me is you don't really need to move the shelves, just put things under the plants to move them up to the lights. So that's what I do. And that's all my plants getting ready to go outside to harden all my varieties. So let's take questions. I just realized I'm taking a really long time on that section. So if there aren't many questions, we can just keep going.
There's just 2 actually.
Okay.
One of them is if you have peppers in pots, should you move them to the shade to get a better summer harvest? I think this is referring to your talk about the difference in temperatures, and sometimes if it's too hot, you know, it can affect their progress.
You can do that as it gets into those 90 degree days, or kind of move them around, especially if you have them in containers. Sure. I mean, if they're in the garden, you could actually, there are ways you could shade them with like row cover and hoops or something like that, just to kind of relieve it a little bit. So yeah.
Okay. Another question was whether hot and sweet peppers need to be planted in separate locations.
Only if you are trying to save seed. If you're trying to save seed, you need to keep them, they say, as much as, I've seen 150 feet apart, and I've seen what's the other, 500 feet apart. So companies that are saving seed, they definitely have to have varieties protected. Sometimes people put like netting over their plants so that they keep insects from pollinating their plants by moving pollen from another type of variety. But growing them in the same area won't make a sweet pepper hot. It's possible that the seed from the sweet pepper in the next generation, if you save it, could be hot if there are varieties that work well together in terms of cross fertilization.
Okay. And then just one more question popped in. should, whether using a paper egg carton as the initial, is a paper egg carton an okay container for initial seedlings, excuse me.
Yeah, you're gonna have to pot it up sooner. You'll have to put it into the bigger plant sooner because it doesn't have a lot of depth for roots or anything, but you could try that, sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's it.
All right. Okay, so let's talk. So we're getting ready to plant. So you want to harden off your transplants, even if you got them from a store or a hardware store or something. That just means decreasing the water, stop fertilizing, and but over 5 to 7 days, you just basically expose them to outside conditions, more wind, more sun, and changing temperatures. So you might start putting them out for a couple hours, bring them back in. And you might start putting them out in the shade, and then 4 hours maybe, and bring them back in. So I start mine out in the north side of my house, which is in the back, and then I move them to the south side of my house, which is in the front, and I move them into like our common courtyard, and I get them out there, and then I end up leaving them out overnight. I check the temperatures, and when it starts to look like it's going to be more like the 50s, I'll leave them out overnight. So it's a matter of keeping an eye on the weather and kind of going. It's kind of pretty easy. That's what that means. So when to plant them. So here's our transplant window. In our area here, it's April 30 to as late as July 19. But if you're doing something that's like a hot pepper, a really hot pepper that has a long period to maturity, that might not work as well. But something like a bell, which is a shorter maturity level, that might work okay in terms of the transplant. And you'll easily be harvesting peppers into late October, even possibly into November if you've had, because sometimes we don't even have our first frost until like the 10th or the 11th of November, like the far end of the range for our area. And that'll actually be a great time, like September, October. You'll get lots of peppers, and it's great. So what you want to do is look at whether your transplants are ready. They don't have to be used. They have to have, I think they usually say like 3, 4, or 5 sets of true leaves, and if they're hardened and they look good, they can go in and pay attention to the maturity for the variety that you've selected. Again, you want to look for night temperatures. Judy Salveson at her demo garden likes to forecast 55 degrees for at least 7 days before she puts in peppers. I also look for a little bit for the soil to be warmish, getting warmer. What she's found is some research that says that if you actually put peppers in where the temperatures are night or a lot colder, you can end up, the plants will never actually recover, and you won't get quite the performance out of them that you might have gotten had you got them in when the nighttime temperatures are at least 55 or over. So she kind of goes by that now. We recommend planting on a cloudy day or in the evening, just so you don't have like this beating sun coming down on these plants that even though you've hardened them off, they're still going to have to adjust a little bit. So, how do you plant them? You want to wet the soil so that it doesn't fall apart when you go to take them out. You want to make it easy so that you can take them out. Generally, there'll hopefully be enough roots in the pot that the soil will mostly stay with the roots, so you can, when you take them out. You want to dig a hole just large enough for the plant to go in, and you want it to go in at the same depth as the container that you took it out of. Unlike tomatoes, you don't tend to plant peppers deeper than where they were growing before. Then you want to just fill the hole around the plant, tap it down nicely, and then you want to lightly water. I like to put about a pint of a diluted fish emulsion around each plant to wet the soil around the roots. One of Judy's tricks is she actually puts a diluted fish emulsion solution into a larger container, and then she puts all of the plants into that water solution while she's prepping to plant them. And that way they have that fish emulsion solution right around the roots, as opposed to watering from the top and sort of spreading out around the area of the plant. So I'm going to try that this year. Then I set my pepper supports in place. I try to do it when I plant them. If not, I try to do it in the next couple of days before it gets too far. And then you just want to keep an eye out and protect the plants from any exceptional heat that comes up, which can happen in our area, or some kind of storm or wind, or extra cold. You could save things like gallon milk containers and take the top off and take the bottom off, and maybe have them as a little bit of a wind or a cold break if needed. You just need to make sure that you take them off when the sun comes out so that you don't boil your plants. So when you're thinking about planting, I wanted you to just keep in mind this idea of companion planting. Here's the things that are good to plant near peppers. Here's the things on the right that are not so good to plant near peppers. And it just gives you an opportunity to try to improve the performance of your peppers. It may bring in some more insects to help with pollination. It can actually help with nutrients, and sometimes it can actually give you better vegetable yield. So here's just some thoughts for that. Here's a couple of layouts. This layout's actually kind of a little bit spread out. I think I used it originally for a tomato layout, and maybe I didn't actually adjust it so much for this. So each one of those blocks is a foot, so it's a foot by a foot. And so I would probably actually move my peppers a little bit closer together, but you could still do, like, say, the peppers with the basil, or you could do them with Swiss chard, that middle one, or carrots. And it just gives you a chance to, one, it's pretty, and two, it gives you a chance to grow some other things in some of those spaces that you have. That's just some ideas. I tend not to make my beds any wider than 3 foot, because I find it's hard not to step on the bed if I have it, like, say, 4 foot wide, unless you can kind of get at it from both sides, and maybe that might work. So you can see there on the bottom one, the 10 foot by 3 foot one, I sort of done this sort of diagonal kind of thing with my plants, and that lets me get a little bit more in there with the spacing. So here's the thing, gambling on the weather. If your plants are ready and you want to get them in the ground, and here it is, it's the beginning or mid-April, and we're telling you that it's the last typically the last frost of the year for the season. You can go for it. If you only have a couple plants, you may not want to put them all in, just in case you want to have something in your back pocket. At the very least, if you plant, keep an eye out on the weather, and be prepared to protect them. I have some hoops and row cover. Row cover is like an agricultural cloth that will raise temperatures when I put it over plants, like 4 degrees. So if it's going to get down to 32, I can use something like that. If you have a way to, you just don't want the cold to, like, come down on top of the plant, but you also don't want the cover to rest on the plant, because that's not so great either, because then where it touches the plant, it could actually damage it. But you might want to just keep an eye out. Like I said, a gallon milk container could work. So now you're into the season, your pepper plants are growing. So let's talk about what you're going to do. Once they've really been established, you don't always do this right away, because you want to kind of give them a chance. You can put mulch around the plants, and that could be decomposed leaves. It can be grass that hasn't been treated by chemicals. It can be straw, but you want to do that because it helps keep down the weeds. It protects the plants, the soil, from some of that high temperature, and it'll keep that moisture in when it rains. I like to prune away any of the leaves that touch the ground. That way I prevent any possible soil-borne diseases to get transferred to the plant, especially if stuff splashes up. And it also promotes airflow, and airflow is always nice for trying to keep some of the diseases down that we're going to talk about shortly. I already recommended that if you haven't already, you should put in some kind of support for your plants. When you looked at the seed package, it would tell you generally how tall your plants are going to be, or if it's plants that you've maybe grown before you're even already aware of this. But if they're very bushy and heavy yielding plants, you're going to want to put in maybe one of the tomato cages that doesn't work for tomatoes. Those sort of 36-inch or those 48-inch cages are great. Or stakes. You can buy the rubber coated metal stakes. Those work great. You can, if somebody has bamboo near you, you can get big pieces of that and cut them down to 4 or 5 foot. But the nice thing is you want to put them in near the main stem of the plant. And then I like to use some of that plant Velcro that they sell, or twine to gently tie the plant to the stake. But I like to do that early, before the leaves, before the roots have actually had a chance to develop, because then when you're putting the stakes in, you're actually damaging some of the roots, and I don't want to do that. we talked about you need to have sufficient watering, but what you want to do is make sure that, especially when they're flowering or fruiting, that's a really important time for there to be water. But you don't want to spray from the top. When you're watering yourself, what you want to do is water at the base. I like to get one of those nozzles that has a soaker feature. Some folks may be able to have watering systems in place, which is really nice. But you want to get about an inch a week, a sufficient rain, if it's sufficient rain, and that should be good. One thing you don't want to do is overwater peppers, and you don't want the roots sitting in water. They really dislike that. For about $10, you can get yourself a moisture meter that you stick into the soil down a few inches, and it generally will tell you dry, moist, or soaking. And you definitely don't want it having to be soaking. You want to let it dry out if you've had a lot of rain. Don't depend on the surface look of the soil. At the very least, stick your finger down to the second knuckle and see how it feels there, not just by the surface look. After the plants have had the first fruit set, you want to side dress with a fertilizer, but use one that has a low nitrogen number, that first number. So it could be like a 2,4,3, because the potassium and the phosphorus help with some of the fruit set and the pod development. Let's talk a little bit about pollination. Peppers are self-pollinators, and that's because they have what's called a complete flower. And so that means that they actually have the male and the female parts in their flower. And so that means that they can actually, the male part can fertilize the female part. In the same plant, if from wind blowing and from insects coming in, the male part can also fertilize the female part of another flower. What also can happen sometimes is that pollen can be brought from insects over to the female part on your plant. It doesn't impact the pod that grows from that plant. For instance, if you have a bell pepper and it happens to get fertilized by pollen from a hot pepper, it won't cause that bell pepper to be hot. What it could do is, it's possible that if you were to save the seed from that pepper and then grow it the next season, it's possible that the pepper that you get isn't the same as the original parent pepper, same as the pepper plant that pepper came from, because at that point, that seed is possibly the combination of the female from the bell, and then possibly the male from a hot pepper, but it won't affect that particular plant. So that means that if you wanted to, you could actually cover your peppers with a shade cover, or you could cover them with some kind of a netting and keep out the insects. If you were trying to, let people do that if they're trying to actually seed save, or if there are companies or individuals that are actually trying to grow peppers for seed, for sharing or for sale. If they want to make sure that pepper seeds are of that plant, they need to make sure that there aren't other peppers. A lot of times they say 50 to 150 feet away if you're trying to keep that pepper strain pure. And I've even read as far away as 500 feet. Generally, if you're just starting from new seed every year that you purchased, it doesn't matter. So that picture, I just wanted you to see that so you knew what to look at, because another possibility is you can help improve pollination. So you do want wind, and if you're growing your plants in some kind of a protected area where it doesn't get enough wind, you may want to help ensure that pollination is happening. And if you don't have pollinators and insects nearby and bees to help with that, which is the first way to have pollination and to improve it, is you can just give the plant a shake now and then once the flowers form. And you should just kind of see some of the pollen possibly around the petals when you do that. So just, shake the plant. And the easy reason to do that is you get sort of the whole plant, because if you do option 3 or 4, you're going to actually take your finger, you're going to stick it in the flower, and you're going to move it around and try to transfer the pollen. Or you can take a Q-tip and move it around in the flower, or put it into that flower and move it to another flower. And so obviously, if you do it that way, you're going to have to be working with the individual flower as well. If you just shake the plant, or if you just have insects and wind, allowing the pollen to be fall onto the female part, that's kind of easy. And so there's a picture of a pepper flower, and then there's a picture of the fruit just starting out here. You can see how small it is. So I talk about high temperature because in Northern Virginia, the last few years, we've actually seen extended periods of daytime temperatures in the 90s, sometimes even in the upper 90s. And also important in impacting performance of the plants is we're seeing nighttime temperatures greater than 70 degrees for an extended period. And so what happens is that hampers fruit set, and sometimes it even hampers the flowers, the blossoms forming. And so you can be kind of disappointed because you feel like you have this beautiful plant and you're watering it, but you're not seeing any you're seeing flowers, but you're just not seeing any peppers forming, or you're not seeing the flowers, right? The pods ripening. So if they're green and they're supposed to ripen to a red or an orange or a yellow, it just seems like it's taking a really long time. In that case, you really just need to be patient, because in our area, peppers will reward us in September and October for sure. But in the meantime, you want to pay attention to the watering and track it. And if we've gotten a lot of rain, like last year in August, we had 6 inches of rain in 1 week. And so you definitely didn't want to water at that point, even though maybe shortly after it looked like the soil surface was dry. But remember, we have that heavy clay. And so that could mean that down below where the roots are, we could have really heavy standing kind of water. So we don't want to overdo it. But you could shade them. You could do a row cover kind of thing, or grow them in a way that they're shaded by taller plants in the late afternoon. Like if you have tomatoes, which tend to grow really tall, and they can cast some shade over. So you could sort of plan your garden in that way, such that in the late afternoon, you might have tall plants actually shading your peppers. That's not such a bad thing. And if you haven't mulched earlier, you should definitely consider mulching at that point to help shade and keep the soil a little bit cooler there. So harvesting is fairly simple. When you start to see some peppers that are kind of a good enough size, not like those tiny ones I showed you the picture of before, but you want to start to harvest a little bit, because it helps the plant, it keeps the plant making more flowers. You know, if you take pods off the plant naturally goes to form more flowers, which means you're going to get more fruit. Definitely don't pull the peppers off. Although some will work okay that way. Some of the hot peppers, it's not so bad to pull them. What I find is, I get impatient, and I don't have a pair of my shears or my small scissors with me, and I go to pull one, and next thing you know, I pulled off, part of the branch, and of course it has flowers on it, and so that means that that's pods that I'm not going to get, and you don't want to destroy your plant. So what I do is you hold it with one hand, and I cut with the other. And you do it carefully, and it just works better. And you need to know what your variety is. So if it's supposed to be a red or a yellow pepper, well, it's always going to start green, and then it's going to turn color, and you just have to be patient for that. You can eat it as a green pepper, and you might even want to pick a few again in the beginning before they turn red or yellow, just so you can kind of get the plant really going. But then you need to be patient. But they taste good. There just won't be as sweet. And if you're wondering why do red and yellow and orange peppers cost more in the grocery store, it's because it takes longer for them to ripen. And so the growers are having to wait for those plants. And so their fields are tied up when they're growing red, orange, and yellow peppers. And as peppers change color, they do actually get more healthy for us. They actually have more vitamin C and more vitamin A, and they even have some of the lutein type vitamins that are good for eyes and stuff like that. So, peppers are great for us from a health perspective. And then the last thing is, as you harvest your peppers, you can refrigerate them. They'll last easily 2 or 3 weeks, so long as they don't have any soft spots or anything on them, like where they've had a little damage. And they can also easily be frozen with or without the stems and the seeds, and they'll last quite a long time, and they'll be perfectly fine even months later if they've been frozen when they were nice and fresh and haven't been defrosted, over and over. So now let's look at pepper diseases. I'm going to not get into detail on this because I actually find that we don't have that many diseases. There's a lot of diseases. You look at this list and you say, what do you mean there's no diseases? There's like eight there under fungal, and then we have these bacterial, and then we have the viral. And yeah, we do. But generally peppers are pretty low maintenance. In our area in Northern Virginia, we have some issues with some of the fungal diseases, sometimes the southern blight and the Phytophthora blight under viral on the bottom there. And matter of fact, that picture there of the Arapaho that I had on my experience chart, that one clearly had a blight situation, and it could have come up from the soil. And so rather than go into all the details on all these, because you may not ever have to deal with them, what I wanted you to do is be aware of them and know that some of these conditions can happen. And I've given you in a couple minutes, you'll see some resources so you can go check and see if you have a problem. Some of the blights, the only thing you can do is take that particular plant out. In this case, this one here with the Arapaho, there were 3 other pepper plants by it, and they were all fine. And just this one ended up being impacted. And I actually was able to still use those peppers. There's nothing wrong with the peppers, but I couldn't wait for them to change color because the plant was slowly wasting away. The other thing in terms of pepper pests, the one that people see mostly is maybe aphids, and there's definitely some flowers that you can grow, calendula and some others that actually either the aphids like the flower and they'll stay away from your pepper plant, or the smell of the flower may actually discourage the aphids. And sometimes we'll get some whiteflies or stink bugs. But again, what I recommend is being aware that there could be issues. If your plant looks good and your pods look good, don't worry about it. If you're starting to think that there's something going on, look at some of the resources I'm providing you. And if you're still stuck, I would send a picture or a description to the Master Gardener Help Desk and ask for some help. I think that's the best thing for a particular problem. But I love this link here on this slide, the Master Gardener Between the Rows. For each month, they talk about pests that you might have to worry about for certain vegetables that you might be growing. And the June post talks specifically about tomatoes and peppers and some of the pests. And so I highly recommend that. And it's worth a read through even before you get to June, just so you can kind of be on the lookout. But in terms of the bugs, here's some of the specific ones that were listed on the slide below. So, here's aphids, but they're tiny, and this is a close-up of them. There's a stink bug. It's pretty easy to see, and actually they're kind of easy to actually catch, and you could just catch them between your fingers, and I just squeeze them, or you dump them into water or something like that. Colorado potato beetle, they're kind of fast. Hopefully you won't get those. In the bottom there, I show a picture of the damage from the thrip, because the thrips are almost microscopic. I mean, that's a female on the left and a male on the right, but seeing them to the eye, you see the damage, I think, before you actually see the bug. And I've seen that occasionally on some of my chili plants. And then there's whitefly, which you'll also get on some of your cold crops like kale. And that you'll see that whitish look of the leaves sometimes again before you see the whiteflies. But sometimes when you see that, if you touch the plant, you'll see them kind of fly up, and you'll be aware that you have them. But in the references, we give you some hints on things you can do in terms of insecticidal soap that you can make, or in terms of some insecticides that are okay to use in an organic garden. So here's some of the resources. The top one is from Penn State University. That's a really good one. I like the plant problem image gallery because it does have the pictures, and sometimes that's really quite helpful. The one from Purdue is really good. And then the last 2 are from Virginia Tech, and that's from our integrated pest management guide. And what's nice about that is it actually tells you some of the things you can do the low level before you actually move off into pesticides. So those links are all great and can provide additional help if you actually run into a problem with a disease or a pest. Other thing that can happen is you can actually have some pepper disorders that are caused by what I call imbalance, and it's really like some kind of imbalance in the soil. And occasionally the one I'll see is blossom end rot, which is the top one, and that's that picture in the upper right. Interesting thing is The pepper itself around that is fine, and you can just cut that off and eat the rest of the pepper. It's not, because it's not actually a fungus or a disease. What happens is that the plant isn't able to get calcium, and so it can't actually create the whole outside skin of the plant that protects the plant. And so you get this like water area, and then over time it can actually get infected because it's like open like that. But when it first starts, it's the plant that you can actually eat the pod, just cut that part off. The other thing you might see, not very often, but possibly, is this magnesium deficiency. But they say more in sandy soils, and we don't really have that in our area. We tend to have the heavy clay soils. And occasionally you can get some issues with yellowing, and it could be a nitrogen deficiency. So you can keep an eye out for that. Again, if you're not sure whether it's that or one of the diseases, best bet is to check in with the pictures in one of the previous references, or send a picture to the help desk and have them help you. Picture on the bottom right is from one of the universities, and that was a salt injury problem. In that case, there was some kind of rain, and it washed the salt down into the root region, and so you had that kind of appearance of the leaves. But you can sort of wash the water some more if that was a problem, and kind of help wash some of the salt away. But there are just some things to be aware of. It's not all diseases and pests. It could be some of these imbalances in the soil. Again, fairly rare, fairly rare. So here are some environmental stress issues. I put cold soils on the top because, again, we were talking about when you should plant. And so in addition to having to worry about frost, one of the problems is that peppers really don't like cold temperatures at night. And so if the night temperatures are less than 55 in that 45 to 50 range, or even colder, you can actually cause the plant to be stunted, and it might not really recover. Like, the plant won't die, but the plant might not be as big as you expected, and the fruits may even be kind of misshaped. So you really don't want to be too quick to plant. And if you are, see what you can do to cover it so that the plant doesn't actually get impacted if the temperature happens to get low. The other thing that can happen is this fruit drop thing. We talked about that. Some of the stresses on that are the high temperature, occasionally insufficient water, or if it gets really windy, and some of that. But again, if you have that problem, you can check and see what's going on. You might be well aware that you've had an issue with high temperature, or that you have an issue with humidity, and the plant will recover. It's just that you have to be patient and give it some time. You will sometimes see sun scald. Like, say for instance, if you maybe you harvested and you accidentally broke off part of the branch, and you had some peppers that weren't yet ready, and so you left them. You left them when we're waiting. If they were exposed to really heavy sun, sometimes you'll get these little scald spots where it's like kind of a little tannish area, where it really just gets like sunburned. So, and it can also happen sometimes on some of the foliage, and generally it'll recover from that, and you can again take the plant, take the pod, and cut away that part, and you can still eat it. And then occasionally you'll get some wind injury kind of things. Big issue is seedlings. Like, today was a really windy day out when I was at my garden, and I wanted to do some transplanting, and I didn't realize until I got there how windy it was. And I thought, I was glad I wasn't actually transplanting any kind of peppers, because it really probably wouldn't have been a really good day to do that, because they're pretty tender, even though we've tried to strengthen the stems by blowing a fan over them and all when we're growing our transplants. They're still a little tender until they get outside and really get acclimated. So it would definitely not have been a good day to transplant. So that's pretty much everything taking us through growing seeds, if we're going to grow seeds, for transplants, and buying transplants and knowing what to look for, and planting and watching them through the season. So there's a couple areas I'm not going to get into in detail, but I wanted to mention them as thoughts, ideas, and then let you know that I've provided a link that I'll show you near the end, where they have a couple really nice guides on some of these. So one thing is you can cross chili peppers, and there's lots of people out there that love really hot peppers or love different looking kind of peppers. And so you could actually create a new pepper variety. Now it can take some time to actually create a pepper variety and have it actually be stable, like quote, like domesticated. It can, matter of fact, when they are trying to bring out new bell peppers, I think I mentioned this earlier, it can take 8 years to actually come up with a new bell pepper that has possibly, say, disease resistance or something, because it takes a while. That's like 8 generations to actually get to where that seed that you've gotten to will grow the same thing over and over again. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And if you actually save some seed, that's that last thing, if you might next year not get quite what you thought. It might not be exactly the same as the parent, but you may find that it's a mix of 2 different kinds of peppers that you were growing, and that can be kind of fun. Last thing is, because the pepper is tropical, and it's actually a perennial, just not in our area, 7A, 7B, you can actually take advantage of it. And you can, if you have a plant that did really well, you can overwinter it and keep it and have it survive, and then put it back outside again. And you might even be able to bring it inside and possibly get some peppers during the winter months, depending on where you have an option to keep that pepper plant, and whether you prune it for wintering over without having peppers. And there are 3 guides on this on the chiliman.org website, which I'm providing a link for, that do a good job and introduce you to this idea if you want to keep going with getting more creative with peppers. So the whole program today focuses on peppers, but we're talking about it from the point of view of what the master gardeners call best management practices. So if you don't know what your soil is, if you don't know whether it's acidic, and you don't know whether the nutrients in it are sufficient for what you're trying to grow, you should do a soil test. And I know that Julie provided a link to that information, or you can go to mgnv.org and do a search, and you'll find the link for the soil test. They do them at Virginia Tech. You provide the soil. They show you on the back of the application form how to actually do a soil sample. And you mail it off to them, and they'll email you back a response within usually 1 to 2 weeks. And it'll tell you things like the phosphorus and the potassium and the other micronutrients. And you can also get information about the organic matter, the percent organic matter in your soil. And it's very helpful to know. And then especially the pH, because you know that you want your soil to be slightly acidic for peppers and most garden vegetables. The other thing is, make sure that you know what the drainage capacity is for your garden. It'd be helpful if you're planting in the ground to, you can do a soil drainage test. And if you look at the vegetable gardening without fear briefing, in part 1, we show how to actually do a soil drainage test. But maybe maybe you've seen that in your garden. When you get a lot of rain, you get puddles and it sits. And if you were to dig down, you actually still have quite a bit of water. And so that may cause you to either try to raise your beds up a little bit, or maybe even go to containers or grow bags. We talked about right plant, right place, hot areas, planting a location that works for you. Select plants, pepper varieties that you want to grow. If you want to grow hot peppers, don't grow bells. If you're starting out, jalapenos do really well in this area. Habaneros do well. Banana peppers do well. Quite a few of the Fresnos, the cayenne, they all do quite well in this area. And then there's a lot of the unusual ones. As you get to the super hots, though, keep in mind that they may take longer to ripen. So allow enough time for maturity, and don't be surprised if they're not ready until September and October for sure. We talked a little bit about companion planting, and I gave you a list that I put together of some of the things that you can companion plant nearby peppers and some of the things you shouldn't. And I gave you just a hint of the insects and the diseases that you might need to worry about, and ways to go find out more if you have some problems. And then lastly, we recommend not planting peppers in the same spot every year. If you have to, because that's the only spot you have, just be sure that you replenish the nutrients in the soil, because they're a pretty heavy feeder and they're going to need nutrients in the following year. And make sure that you don't leave debris in the bed over the winter for pests or other pathogens to build up over the winter, especially around us where we don't get a really cold winter, and so things don't really die out. So Master Gardeners in Northern Virginia is the volunteer arm, and we support the Virginia Cooperative Extension. And so we're all volunteers from Alexandria and Arlington, and we've been around since 1985. I've talked about the help desk. Definitely, they welcome your questions, send pictures, send descriptions. They'll get back to you if they need more information. If you're in the area, we have plant clinics in Arlington and Alexandria, at the farmers markets and at the libraries. That should be all starting up again this year in 2022. We also have a lot of virtual classes. You can go to our virtual classroom. I mentioned the vegetable gardening without fear class that we taught earlier in February and in second part in March. And we have a demonstration garden, the Potomac Overlook Organic Demonstration Garden. That's a picture of it there on the lower right. And you're welcome to visit there all summer long, and you can see how they're doing. And on Wednesdays mornings, when the gardeners are there working, the volunteers, you can ask questions. And lastly, if you go to our website, there's lots of resources. If you go on the web, say you go to any of the web search engines, if you say site:/edu or site:/gov, that ensures that instead of just getting a somebody's hobby site, that you get researched material generally. So on our website, here's some of the good links. Between the rows, it tells you things to do on a monthly basis. That's also the place you'll find the monthly information on bugs during the growing season. There's also the link for the classroom. And then lastly, there's a ton of links about vegetable gardening, sort of the range of vegetable gardening in that last one, vegetable gardening online references. If you're not in the Northern Virginia area and you want to find your cooperative extension office, that first bullet will tell you about it. If you don't know your hardiness zone, which is important to know if you're going to be doing seed starting and planting out, that second link will help you with that. And then lastly, that final link has lots of good information about frost maps, hardiness, and even some stuff about climate maps with some of the temperature ranges for your area. All three are very good references. And then lastly, some fun things. Here's some favorite ways to use peppers. So here's a recipe on the left, on the right, that's from my Washington Post, and that's my marked up copy. If you want to try to make some quick pickled jalapenos, it's quite good. We've been making sriracha hot sauce for probably 5 or 8 years now. And we use a range of hot peppers, and it comes out a little different every time, but it's quite nice. If you've never tried candied jalapenos or stuffed bell peppers, but done chicken Philly cheesesteak style, that's fantastic. And folks that got an email this morning, you should have gotten my mom's recipe for sausage and peppers with my little changes to it. And then I have a recipe for using poblano peppers called Dona. So that's just a little fun thing for a variety of peppers. And then lastly, I had mentioned there were some references that I really liked. Here's University of Maryland Extension. They have a lot of good things. That's their pepper page. The Chili Pepper Institute, not only do they have a lot of references about chili peppers, but they actually grow some, have derived some chili pepper varieties, and that's pretty interesting. And then Johnny's is just one of the many seed suppliers, but they have a really nice library on peppers with information. And earlier in one of the slides, I talked about the Scoville, so that heat number, right? The SHU for peppers. This particular link for the Scoville organization, you can go in and enter any pepper name and search for it, and then it'll tell you what the range is of heat for that. And that's kind of helpful, especially if you're at a hardware store or nursery and you find a pepper variety that's new to you. You could look it up on your phone and check to see, is it your interest in heatness, or is it maybe too hot? And then here's some informal pepper references. On Facebook, there's some groups, the Pepper Growing for Lovers, and the Pepper Lover ones is very interesting. A lot of people on that website like to do create new hybrid types of peppers, and they have lots of ideas for you. And you can actually even get some free seeds for sending in sending them a self-addressed stamped envelopes. If you want to try something new, if you've been doing peppers for a while and want to branch out, recommend that. Chiliman.org has the guides for seed starting, wintering over, and some information about creating new hybrids. And then and Pepper Scale also have a lot of good information and share their experience. And I like those websites very much. And then lastly, if you really want to get into it, I found some interesting articles while I was doing my research for this, and some of them are scholastic and they come from universities, and some of them are just really nice stories about how hot pepper evolved and how it impacts our history and the world. And so some of these, and even the one on a closer look at sweet pepper breeding and its challenges, is quite interesting when you hear them talk about, from an industrial perspective, how they create the new varieties that work better in terms of some of the diseases and stuff. So those are all fun reading if you have the time and the interest. And then lastly, here's a link to our planting chart. This is for the Arlington, Alexandria area, and this is on the MGNV website. The front of it provides this really handy kind of snapshot of when to plant. And so you can see the pepper line on there, and it's telling us around April 30th is when we would plant. And the little asterisk means that you're going to plant a transplant versus a seed. And then it shows you that you can, harvest all the way up until, let's see, into October. So that's really nice. And that's it.